Alrighty, so this week I'll be sharing the story of a botanist that I sort of stumbled across recently. And we don't have any of their specimens here at Tennessee, or at least not any that I could find in our databases. But one of our global partners, the New York Botanical Garden, does. So I will share one of those examples here. You can see there's several associated labels, so I'm just going to zoom in on the collection information, which is here. And this specimen was collected by, this is Miss Hutchins in Bantry, Ireland. And Bantry is down here on the southwest coast of Ireland in the County Cork. And there isn't a collection date on the label anywhere. We can see that as it was part of the herbarium of William Mitten in 1908, but I can tell you based on the collector that at that point it was already almost 100 years old, and it actually dates to the early 1800s. So here's the specimen. It was identified as Herbertus hutchinsiae, commonly known as juniper prunewort. It is a liverwort, but it is commonly mistaken for a moss. In the British Isles, it grows on, you can see the coasts of Ireland, of Scotland, and England. But I also found some references to specimens in the US, in Canada, Norway, Korea, so definitely other regions. And here are some pictures of it out in the wild. It often has this really pretty orangey color. So Miss Hutchins was Ellen Hutchins, who is considered to be Ireland's first female botanist. She was born in 1785 in Ballylickey, which is a town in the county of Cork. That's on Bantry Bay. And this is not her. Sadly, there are no known portraits of Ellen Hutchins, but she was one of 6 children, and her father passed away when she was 2 years old. She was sent to school in Dublin, but her health suffered, and some sources say she was a sickly child. Another one mentioned possibly malnutrition, so I'm not sure if there was like a Jane Eyre Lowood school situation going on, but regardless, and luckily a friend, she was taken in by a family friend called Dr. Whitley Stokes. He took her to live in his home so she could regain her strength. And he also helped to impart in her an interest in natural history and botany. And they believed that physical activity outside in the open air would be good for her health. And it was. In 1805, she returned back to her hometown to care for her mother and her brother Thomas, who was disabled. And while she acted as their caregiver, she also spent time outdoors collecting plants in the Bantry Bay area. And interestingly, this region is home to Lusitanian flora, which is a unique community of plants that's found on the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal, and Southwest Ireland, and nowhere else. So very unique. And it was also not really well studied at that time. So she began to specialize in mosses, liverworts, lichens, and also on seaweed, which were very diverse along her local coastline. She had a very good eye for identifying plants and finding unique examples. It said that she found 7 new species to science in just her first 2 years of collecting. She created detailed watercolor illustrations and meticulously prepared specimens. And her drawings and descriptions are especially important because some of the characteristics of plants, and especially like marine algae, can change really significantly when a fresh specimen is dried. So she was able to capture that information when she was collecting them. So seaweed was not very well understood at the time. There was debate on whether they were plants or animals, maybe related to sponges. But Hutchins was actually the first to observe and record reproductive structures on seaweeds on a species called the velvet horn. And you can actually see her original drawings and specimens from that discovery. She sent a lot of her specimens out to other botanists for description, many of whom she met through that family friend, Dr. Stokes. One of them was James Townsend Mackay, who was a Scottish botanist living in Ireland, and he worked as the curator at Trinity College Botanic Garden, and she contributed specimens to his work on Irish flora. He also sent several of her seaweed specimens to English banker / botanist Dawson Turner, who specialized in cryptogams. And his thank you note that he sent back to Hutchins began a strong friendship and extensive correspondence that spanned 7 years. The pair had never actually met in person, but exchanged countless letters, specimens, and drawings. Turner even named his youngest daughter Eleanor after her. So in 1809, Turner asked Hutchins if she would create a comprehensive inventory of plants in her local area, which she undertook under over 3 years, documenting more than 1,100 different species. She recorded over 400 vascular plants, 200 algal species, 200 different types of bryophytes, and 200 lichens. And those specimens and her species lists from West Cork in 200 years ago are really invaluable today as a snapshot of the past. So they've actually been used to help date the decline of species as agricultural practices changed, and also track the arrival of invasive species. Hutchins never actually published under her own name, but she contributed to a lot of botanical works, and her specimens and drawings were featured in many publications. In Sir William Hooker's British Jungermanniae, which is a compendium of that liverwort genus, he wrote of Miss Hutchins of Ballylickey near Bantry, a lady whose valuable communications on the subject of marine botany are already before the public, and whose zeal and knowledge in the present genus of plants I shall frequently have occasion to notice in the progress of this little work. To her, through the kindness of my friend, Mr. Turner, I am indebted for many of the most rare and interesting species, which will be here described. And her name is associated with almost all the rare species in the book. Other specimens she found, including rare lichens, were described by Lewis Weston Dillwyn in his book, British Confervae. And you can see some examples of her descriptions or her observations in the species descriptions, like Miss Hutchins says that when fresh, it is of a beautiful pale green color. And this one was found on the shells of a large scallop at Bantry Bay by Miss Hutchins. The present is one of numerous species for the discovery of which the botanical world is indebted to Miss Hutchins. And there's many more examples like this. So she was obviously well known in the botanical community for her skill in finding new and rare species. And I'll share just a couple more quotes from some contemporary botanists. So in 1809, Dillwyn and Joseph Woods visited Ballylickey, finding Hutchins a very sensible, pleasing, square-made, and tolerably good-looking woman, whom both considered almost the best botanist, either male or female, that we ever met with. James Edward Smith claimed that she could find almost anything, and William Jackson Hooker, overwhelmed by her contributions to his monograph on liverworts, told Turner in December 1811 that Miss Hutchins' discoveries alone will form an appendix as large as the work itself. And a year later, he confided to Robert Brown that Miss Hutchins is a mine, but I never intend to bore her lest she should be too prolific. So Ellen was said to also love gardening, including raising some plants that were sent to her by botanists like Mackay. She was a dedicated collector, often rising with the sun. In at least one case, she records getting up at 3 a.m. She describes scrambling up steep terrain and, quote, near breaking my bones on a mountain cliff, seeking Jungermanniae. And she also loved to spend the day out in her little boat collecting seaweed, and she would bring all of her specimens back home to examine with her microscope. Regretfully, this work was often interrupted by periods of ill health. Sometimes she was unable to leave her house for weeks, and also by the demands and needs of her mother and brother. And she shared some of her struggles with those demands in her letters. By 1812, her health was very poor. In 1813, she and her mother moved to the town of Bandon for medical care. Her mother passed away the following year, and Ellen moved back closer to her hometown to be cared for by her brother Arthur and his wife Matilda. Sadly, her health continued to deteriorate, and she passed away in 1815 at the very young age of just 29. She bequeathed her plant specimens to her friend Dawson Turner, and most of those are now at the Natural History Museum in London. Her drawings were given to Turner by her sister-in-law, and more than 200 of them are now in the archives at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, along with Turner's letters to her. And her letters to him are at Trinity College. And then examples of her specimens, artwork, and papers are housed in numerous collections in the UK, Ireland, and the United States. Ellen found at least 20 new species to science, which is especially impressive considering she was only able to conduct her work for just a short 8 years. And while she didn't publish any of those herself, many were named in her honor. So there are several species of lichens, algae, and bryophytes named after her, including our original specimen, Herbartus hutchinsiae. And then there's also a genus of vascular plants. Hutchins was buried in an unmarked grave in the Bantry churchyard, and her story was largely forgotten for some time. However, her contributions were rediscovered, and she has since become a celebrated figure. A plaque honoring her as a natural history pioneer was erected at her burial site in 2015, 200 years after her death. That same year, the very first Ellen Hutchins Festival was held in Bantry, and is now an annual event. It includes guided natural history walks and demonstrations along Bantry Bay. There's an exhibit of her work at the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew in 2019. The Environmental Research Institute at University College Cork renamed their building in honor of her in 2020. And she's the subject of at least 2 books. So there's one, Ellen Hutchins, Botanist of Bantry Bay by Madeline Hutchins, is a short volume about her life. And the book A Quiet Time by Marianne Lee is actually a fictional tale of her life. Specimen-wise, I was able to find 39 in the bryophyte portal, 6 lichens, nothing in vascular symbiota, and 44 on GBIFs. Not really a lot, but then it dawned on me that I needed to check another portal, the macroalgae portal, since she was also a seaweed scientist. And I found 106 more, including some really beautiful seaweed specimens. And I expect there's plenty more, just not digitized or, in other databases. So that is Ellen Hutchins, a very short life, a very short botanical career, but some very important and impressive discoveries. And I will say this is just a brief overview. There's actually some really, really well done articles and websites with a lot more information about her and her career in life, her letters and things like that. So I will share those links after this, and I encourage you to check them out if you are interested in learning more. So thank you again for listening.